got sent to newly registered voters at the Jacksonville Naval Air Station. Some of those couldn't be delivered, presumably because the recipients were overseas for military duty.
You send a letter to a serviceman who's overseas, and you say, that's a fraudulent voter, don't let them vote? Excuse me. Is that the America that these guys are fighting for?
In 2004, Florida wasn't the only state where Republicans set out to challenge likely Democratic voters. In Ohio, the Republicans also launched a huge effort to disqualify voters. Prior to the election, a lawyer for the Republicans held a news conference praising the job they were doing to ferret out fraudulent voters in Ohio.
We sent out thousands of pieces of mail, as did the Board of Elections, and they continue to come back deceased, return to sender, no such person here.
Behind the scenes, Republican officials were delighted. Now was able to obtain some of their email. In one, an official calls the returned letters a gold mine. In another, officials discussed doing the same thing in other battleground states, including Nevada, Florida, Pennsylvania, and New Mexico. In Ohio, the Republicans eventually put together a list of 35,000 people to stop on Election Day.
Okay.
Eddie Hales is a senior attorney for the civil rights organization Advancement Project. Hales points out the Republicans got caught doing this before, back in 1980. Back then, they even signed a legal agreement promising never to do it again. Still, Hales had to file suit to stop them in Ohio.
The Republican State Committee, working in concert with the Republican National Committee, had failed to get these mailings pre-cleared by a judge who had jurisdiction over a consent decree from 1981 that required the Republican National Committee to pre-clear any mailing that was targeted to voters in communities of color.
A judge found the Republicans were in violation of their agreement and ordered their plan to confront voters on Election Day shut down. But they did carry out another plan. Before the election, they had local officials pull thousands of citizens into special hearings to defend their right to vote. Not everyone targeted by the Republicans was African American. Lance Schwartz and his wife Mindy live near Marion, Ohio. Schwartz is a 30-year-old music teacher and a registered Democrat. Republicans made Schwartz come in for one of those hearings.
They were saying that it was based on return mail. They did not have that return mail to show me. There was no proof of that return mail. They just said there was return mail.
Where Schwartz lived, county officials thought the challenges were so weak they threw them all out. There is another big national story connected to these efforts to challenge voters. Key insiders say there's evidence that in 2004 there was a plan to use the colossal legal power of the United States Department of Justice to challenge voters. That too could have been illegal.
Please be seated.
David Iglesias is at the center of the scandal now engulfing the Bush administration. He's one of the 9 U.S. attorneys who were fired. Iglesias is the former U.S. attorney for the state of New Mexico. Over the years, Iglesias says his bosses back in Washington repeatedly asked him to investigate voters. My now colleague Brian Moyers spoke with Iglesias.
This was a priority every 2 years during the election cycle for the Bush administration.
Was there any explanation ever given as to why there was this interest?
No, there was no explanation. I had assumed that was the historic practice of the Justice Department, but I've subsequently learned that this administration has made it a priority.
In 2004, Iglesias also began getting frequent calls from prominent state Republicans. Iglesias says Republicans wanted him to investigate the activities of one group in particular, an organization called ACORN. ACORN is a liberal advocacy group that was working to register new Democratic voters. As you might imagine, Iglesias already had his hands full investigating things like terrorism and drug smuggling.
You have to understand there are approximately 4,000 federal criminal laws, and we're tasked to enforce them all. Do the math, it's impossible to enforce every possible law.
Nonetheless, Iglesias set up a task force to look into the Republican allegations.
We're getting referrals from people who are concerned that this election may be dirty.
Iglesias says his task force could not find a single case of voter fraud worth prosecuting. State Republican officials were so angry, they complained to senior White House aide Karl Rove. A short time later, Iglesias got the boot.
What really scarred the party was the election of 2000, in which the president lost the popular vote but won the presidency through litigation. I believe there was an attempt to not ever let this happen again and win by any means, legal or otherwise. It's reprehensible, it's unethical, it's unlawful, it very well may be criminal.
Iglesias describes himself as a loyal Republican, but he believes the plan to challenge voters was directed by the White House. He also believes that's why key White House officials like Karl Rove have refused to testify before Congress or turn over important documents.
I believe there to be incriminating, possibly criminally incriminating evidence contained in those emails and other memoranda. That's why the White House doesn't want to produce it to the Congress.
Iglesias says for further proof of White House involvement, just look at who was hired to replace one of the fired U.S. attorneys. It was none other than the aide to Karl Rove who helped direct the voter caging program nationwide. We reached out to that aide, as well as to several other Republican Party officials at the state and national level. They refused to comment. But as a result of the allegations by Iglesias and others, Congress is now investigating whether the White House has been working to illegally suppress the minority vote. There are already indications that the Republicans are setting out to challenge voters in the 2008 election. In a speech in April of 2006, Karl Rove claimed that elections have become so tainted by liberal fraud that America is, quote, beginning to have elections like those run in countries where the guys in charge are colonels in mirrored sunglasses.
This is not a confrontation we have sought.
Democrat John Conyers, the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, is leading the investigation into the firing of the U.S. attorneys. Just this week, his committee cited 2 White House aides for contempt of Congress for refusing to testify about the case. Conyers says that secrecy is another sign Republican tricks may be in store for the 2008 election.
They're becoming more sophisticated. Some of the people doing them are getting cleverer and are doing it better than they used to.
And as for reporter Greg Palast, he too plans to keep working on this story, hoping to get to the bottom of it, even if those reports sometimes do seem to make a bigger splash in Britain than they do here in America.
You have to understand, the rest of the world is fascinated by America's democracy and any failures thereof. In Britain, they have a huge contingent of troops in Iraq on America's claim that they are there to fight for democracy, and yet they're finding out that in America, democracy is a pretty tenuous thing.